We're going to talk to Byron Henry. He is an appellate attorney. He's kind of, with the media, become a go-to guy about all things court here in our country, and there are some specific things I want to ask him as we're beginning to look at the onset of a new presidential administration. Let's bring him up. Byron, good afternoon to you, sir, and welcome to the program.
Thanks. Glad to be with you, Pat.
So tell me, one of the things that I'm hearing is even before the new president would begin to do some things working with Congress, even before you would have new Supreme Court justices seated, that there are some actions that a new president could take to basically undo a lot of what the previous administration has done, and this is nothing new?
No, it's not, Pat, and those actions fall into two categories. The first of the categories are the executive orders or executive actions, and those are the things that the former president, in this case President Obama, would have decreed by executive order, such as the executive action or executive order on immigration that was challenged in court, and it was a big deal. So anything that was done by executive order can be undone by executive order when the new president takes office, including the first day the president takes office. So if there are any court cases pending regarding an executive order that gets rescinded by the new president, those cases become moot and they just basically go away. I mean, someone will have to file something, but it's a fait accompli that those cases would be dismissed. The other category are administrative agency actions, such as the new overtime rules under the Department of Labor. You've got the transgender directive with respect to bathrooms and locker rooms that was put out by the Department of Education. You've got the EPA's they call it clean power, the Obama administration, some call it coal killing regulations. But those are a little bit more difficult because there you have to install a new head of an agency, and then the president has to direct that agency to reconsider or redraft rules or issues to come back up through the administrative system. But eventually those actions would also become moot because the government would no longer be taking the same position as they are now at those different executive agency levels.
And Byron, since those are, I mean, the way a new president can do this, because these are actions or edicts, as you say, that have been laid out by these agencies are all under the umbrella of the administration. They're all under the executive branch, and so the new chief executive can exact with them, and if it's not a congressional law or something that a court has already decided, he can go in and the stroke of the pen that put it in place could also remove it.
That's correct. He would install the head of the agency, and the head of the agency, he would direct that head of the agency, the new head of the Labor Department or the Civil Rights Division or the executive or the Education Department, for instance. He would instruct them to redraw the rules, and in some cases these aren't even new rules. These are simply the administrative agency taking a different view of the same law that's been on the books for years, such as Title IX and Title VII. So in those cases, yes, you are correct. All they need to do is send out a new directive under the president's order that that's not the view of the law they take, and that would happen immediately.
Yeah, because you've got two things at play there, don't you, Byron? You've got the law itself, and then you have the executive's interpretation of the law. And my mind goes back, if you recall, back when Jan Brewer was the governor of Arizona, and Arizona developed their own immigration policy because the federal government, the administration, was choosing not to even endorse their own immigration policy. And so a lot of it is not just the law on paper, but it's the interpretation of it, isn't it?
Absolutely, and just to use your example, one example of the immigration law, and the federal government actually went to court to stop Arizona from enforcing their own version, or not their own version so much as taking an active role in immigration enforcement, and the Obama administration went to court and argued before the Supreme Court that it was preempted, meaning Arizona could not take its own action vis-a-vis immigration. And of course, if you had a different administration, you could have actually had an administration going to court as a friend of Arizona saying, yes, Arizona is allowed to fill the gaps in immigration law, so long as they don't contradict or defy federal immigration law, they can be a partner. This administration took the position that they were not allowed to be a partner with the federal government, that it was only the federal government's decision, and the state of Arizona had no say in it.
What has been your experience in the past as you look back, or if you've actually examined it at all? Is this a normal process with the new administration, and is it usually a gradual, we deal with things over time, or have we ever had a case in the past where a new president came in and we just had a whole ream of these things sitting on his desk waiting, and we just signed and went?
Well, it certainly has happened in the past. The Mexico rule, the so-called gag order on abortion, is typical. When a Republican president comes in, they do an executive order that funds international foreign aid funds cannot be used to get for abortions or for organizations that counsel abortion. And when a Democratic president comes in, they always rescind that order, usually on day one or the first 10 days, and change it. So that's commonplace. But what's not common is the fight between the executive and the legislative branch in the last 8 years. Instead of it resulting in some sort of compromise as it did under President Clinton and President Bush when the Congress was of a different party, President Obama took a different tack, and he decided to use his supposed authority as the executive to either interpret laws differently or use administrative agencies. And that means a lot more laws and rules were made by the president almost unilaterally in the last 8 years than I'm familiar with, at least in my lifetime since I've been looking at this, which means there's more for the new president to undo, so to speak. So the more a president does by the stroke of a pen, or as President Obama said, with the phone or the pen, the more the next president has to, quote, change or clean up for his own political leanings. So in this case, President Obama did a lot, which means if Donald Trump wants to follow through with a lot of his promises, he would have to do a lot to undo it, those Obama policies. So that's kind of the fault line. It's always been available and presidents would do it. It just seems like there's a lot more on the table this time with fights between the states and the federal government and these agencies and executive orders than I've seen in the past.
Well, and you know, President Obama has famously tried to claim now for about the last year that he had fewer executive orders than his predecessor, but the way he's done that, Byron, is he's done it by calling them something different than executive orders. Some are administrative actions and things like that, but they're all things that he signed and then puts them into place. Are we right in saying that regardless of what you call different pieces of paper that hit your desk, if it was done with the signature of a president, it can be undone in the same fashion?
Certainly, the executive, we have one executive that runs the executive branch of the federal government. So anything that comes out of an administration, whether it's an executive action, an executive order, a proposed rule, or just an outright change in an interpretation of law like we had from the Department of Education, deciding for the first time in decades that Title VII included sexual orientation and transgender orientation as opposed to what we'd always thought it was. So certainly, whatever you call it, there's been a lot of that going on in the last few years, and the most, I think, drastic examples of that was the immigration policy, where the president actually decided he couldn't get something through Congress and decided through sheer executive force he would change the immigration laws of the country and decide that a lot of people were not subject to deportation and could get work papers where Congress had not provided. So that is those kind of steps are not, I wouldn't say they're not unprecedented, but they're certainly the farthest edge or over the line of what a president's authority. And as you've seen, President Obama's been called on it a few times by courts and by states.
Yeah, exactly. One last question for you. We're talking to Byron Henry. He's an appellate attorney and obviously very knowledgeable about the yings and the yangs when it comes to executive orders and what presidents can and cannot do. Byron, the president was in Lima, Peru over the weekend, and first of all, very unseemly. Presidents don't normally say things against America as a whole or Americans individually when they're on foreign soil. This president seems to find a way to do that. But he was actually asked over the weekend if he would follow the example of George W. Bush and others and stay out of politics once they're out of office, not to make criticisms of the current resident. Will you be like Bush and not criticize your successor? And the president's response was, well, I will if it's necessary. That tells me that the kinds of things you and I are talking about now, the undoing of executive orders, with his temperament, I just have a funny feeling this is the kind of thing that'll just set President Obama off.
Well, it's possible. I'd like to wait and see what he actually does when something comes up. But you have to, I mean, President Obama understands the office. He's been president for 8 years. He knows what he's doing. And you have to know that when you can't get laws passed through Congress and you can't get a mandate from a bill that makes it through Congress and gets signed into law with even a majority, let alone a bipartisan majority, that if you're going to rule or govern the country by executive order and rulemaking authority, then that means your legacy or your policies are subject to undoing by a new president. So the goal of a president for a legacy is to pass laws. that command a majority of the Congress, the people's representatives and senators, sign them into law, which makes it very difficult for those policies to be changed. If you're going to govern with a phone and a pen, then you have to know that your legacy and the policies that you believed in are going to be, on shaky ground. So I'd be surprised if you criticized President now when he becomes President Trump. On every time one of his executive orders gets overturned. He may speak up when there's a wholesale attempt to repeal and replace Obamacare, which was one of the few things he managed to get through Congress. Even though he did it on a straight party line vote, it was voted on by a majority of Congress and signed into law, which is one of the few accomplishments he can tout with respect to law. And so he will probably be sensitive to any attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
If you were sitting on the shoulder of Donald Trump and able to whisper in his ear right now, would it be your suggestion that if you're undoing some of these executive orders, on some of them that you think the response from President Obama, then former President Obama, will be most contentious, would it be your suggestion to maybe go ahead and use executive order to undo it, but then get people in motion immediately and try to get your position on that issue and actually have it made into law?
I think that's the way President, who will then be President Trump, he's president-elect now, will try to govern because he believes he has a mandate and certainly has a Congress. So there's no reason why President Trump can not get things through Congress unless it's extremely controversial. He has a Senate and a House of his own party. So there's no reason why he needs to govern. And, in fact, Republicans decried governing by executive action and rulemaking authority. So I don't think they'll stand idly by while President Trump does the exact same form of governance with overreaching executive orders and changing the law through administrative rulemaking. I think that he has a Congress. He should rescind all he can by executive order if it's something he vowed to do as president, and then he should pitch his policy to Republican Speaker Paul Ryan, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and work out a governing, a first 100 days that enacts his policies that he promised. And there's no reason to go the route of signing executive orders and using that other route. When you have a Congress of your own party, you should make your policies into law. That's the way the system was designed.
Exactly. Well, listen, for your time today, Byron Henry, thank you very much. Why don't we do this? Let's get somewhere into the mid-first 100 days of this administration. Let's revisit each other again and see where we think we are in this process and see if he seems to be following the pattern you think he will. But for this time, I certainly appreciate you and your insight. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Pat.
Thank you. Byron Henry from down in the Dallas area.